Ready for the afternoon.
Becky.
Yeah. Ready? All right, so it's 3:35. Let's go ahead and call the June 17th meeting of the Finance Committee to order. Roll call, please.
Vice Mayor Schaefer?
Here.
Vice Chairman Jones?
Here.
Chairman Hellinger?
Here. All right, and second up, approval of the motion summary.
Move for approval. Second.
Roll.
Vice Mayor Schaefer?
Yes.
Vice Chairman Jones?
Yes.
Chairman Hellinger?
Yes. All right. Third up, discussion of future debt financings.
All right, did they approve the minutes?
Yeah, we're.
Oh, well, we almost got there. So we've got several bond-related matters that are going to be presented to City Council, not at the next council meeting, but probably the one subsequent to that. Wanted to talk about those a little bit, just to make you aware of what's coming. The first big issue is we're going to do a current refunding of our outstanding 2009 bonds that we issued to construct the Southeast Highland Sewer. Those bonds are set to mature in 2037, but because of the interest rate climate that we're in right now, and when we actually sold those bonds, it had a call date of December 1st, 2019. So we can actually refinance, so to speak. And we've been monitoring this for a couple of years because up until earlier this year, you could actually do what was called an advance refunding in advance of the call date. You had to go through a number of different processes, but the people I work with were kind of trying to push us a year or so ago because interest rates are pretty favorable, and we were able to obtain some savings, $600,000, $800,000. But we held off, and now we're at a point where we can actually call them on the call date, and the projected cash flow savings in net present value terms by refinancing over the same maturities, so they'll mature in 2037 just as they otherwise would. The net present value savings are $1.8 million. So what that means to us is that in our current capital plan, we have on average about $999,000 a year put in the plan and appropriated for debt service on this issue. And with the refinancing, that annual debt service will be about $850,000. So it's going to save us about $140,000 a year in debt service. Could look at shortening the maturity on it, but with where our sewer fund's at right now, it's probably better to keep it, at the 18 more years, the remaining life, and keeping it at that. The new bonds that we issue will also have a call date, probably about 2027, 2028. So if things change between now and then, we can also consider refunding them again. The IRS and the federal government did change that provision that allowed for an advance refunding. So we're no longer allowed to do an advance refunding. But anyways, that refunding option also exists with another rather large outstanding debt that we have related to the recreation improvements. I talked about this at a previous meeting. Those bonds, the original $20 million borrowing was issued 2010, and those bonds are callable March 1st, 2020. Now we're not at that call date, and the law allows us to go out 90 days before the call date and actually sell the issue. But I may have mentioned this before too, we're kind of watching the interest rates and where they're at. I think we're pretty good through the remainder of the year, but we'll probably have another large issue towards the tail end of this year that'll bring legislation in front of City Council to adopt. Those are both pretty straightforward, and if interest rates hold where they're at, we'll have similar savings with the rec bonds. What that means to us is, right now, we're projecting perhaps 2025, 2026, we'll have collected enough from that income tax to pay off any of the outstanding debt, and therefore we could rescind that 0.15% income tax that was approved. It's probably not going to lop a year off, but it will certainly increase our odds of sooner than later having that tax rescinded. Along those lines, I'd mentioned it in the past, but with that 0.15% income tax, that'll be in place, and it'll probably be rescinded at the end of a tax year, and so we'll have residual collections that'll come in. So if we were to stop, let's just say that at the end of 2019, the calculation showed we had enough collected to pay out the outstanding debt, then that tax wouldn't be in place for calendar year 2020. But there's going to be people still filing their 2019, 18, 17, 16 returns for quite some time. It's virtually impossible to predict exactly when we're going to collect enough money, because a lot of that, people don't even file their returns until a year after. So it's not like we can come down and say, oh, it's September 13th. That's the date. After September 13th, you no longer have to pay it, because it would just be crazy. So one of the things, we're not that far out, and we'll start looking at it in the out years, is that more than likely there may be, as little as $300,000-400,000 and as much as $700,000-900,000 in residual taxes that'll come in after the tax has been expired. And we had this occur when we renovated City Hall and built the Justice Center, because we had a similar tax. The tax was going to be in place until we collected enough money to pay off the debt. And there was residuals that came in on that too. I haven't gone back and looked specifically at the contract or at the ballot language, but we had in past years already made a determination that that ballot language, when the voters approved that rec levy, not only provided for constructing facilities, but it was interpreted that it could also, those proceeds could also be used for maintaining some things, or because we have gone in with used some of the money already to go in and rebuild, so to speak, tennis courts or whatever else. So it's not an urgent matter, but at some point we'll want to start kicking that around, because it can be a part of our long-term capital planning, that there may be a source there 5, 6, 7 years out that probably is going to need to be spent on either park improvements or even maintaining some of the park improvements that we put in place. So I just mentioned that. A couple other financing, they're not large dollar amounts, but it's things we have previously talked about. The first one applies to the improvements we made at the annex building next door for Cohatch, and then for the second floor improvements. And then hopefully, and this is some of the discussion I want to have today, we still have plans to come back and make improvements to City Hall. Part of it's just relocating some offices. Part of it's making building security improvements that we've talked quite a bit about, and perhaps functionally making the building work well into the future. When we originally talked to City Council in 2018, we had a rough estimate to $200-some thousand of what those costs might be. At the time, we also talked about perhaps taking down the engineering building and putting parking lot, which was kind of a part and parcel too of all the improvements. And that was about $350,000. Both of those amounts are appropriated in the 2019 budget. We haven't really incurred any costs. We have reached out recently to an architect, local architect, to start some general preliminary drawings of where things might be and what might be done. And it's not anything major, but it might be moving some walls around and relocating some things. And that stuff's just starting to filter in now. But it and what I want to have a little bit of a discussion today is, if we looked kind of at an amount that we otherwise think we may spend, or even if it's an upward ceiling amount, it would be advantageous of sorts to include that with the bond issue that we're talking about that'll come to City Council, not the next meeting, but the meeting after that, related to the annex building. I can make it a part of a bigger bond issue, and that helps from the marketability of the bonds. The other element is that Cohatch building, portion of that's for private purpose. We're renting it out. So our ability to issue tax-exempt bonds to finance those improvements is contingent. We may be able to issue tax-exempt, we may not. Had a conference call today with our bond attorneys, and generally, if that borrowing is added to a larger borrowing, and the total amount that we're going to the markets with, if less than 10% of it is for improvements for a private purpose, then the whole issue can, in general terms, can be considered tax exempt. Not just as a better interest rate that we would obtain, but it just makes it a lot easier as far as issuing the debt. With the sewer bonds at about $12.5 million outstanding, with the $2.5 million or whatever that we had talked about borrowing for the building improvements, we're getting close to that point where I think we can maybe get that 10% threshold. So, it would be nice to look at that and also include any money we may need to borrow for the City Hall renovations. Haven't done them yet, don't even have any solid cost projections. But if we could here just a little bit, talk about maybe what your thoughts may be towards improvements here at City Hall. Again, we really haven't gotten into much in the way of details. Primarily, we're looking at making security changes to the building. We've done some things with the entry points to where now the only way to get in for the public is down below us here. When the building was originally built, the kind of the focal point of people coming into the building is that area just outside of my office. We had somebody sitting there, receptionist type of position or part-time positions. So part of the intent would be to move them down there, perhaps put it behind some sort of a barrier, glass wall, because it's not going to do you much good if you're just sitting down there. So we'd be relocating some of the offices there. More than likely, from my standpoint, moving the cemetery office. Carolyn, who does our cemetery work, people have to come into the building now and they come up to that main floor close to where my office is. We put that down on the first floor at ground level. People coming into the building, right there's the cemetery office. So I think it'd be a lot more convenient. So we've got a couple of things like that, shifting some of the offices around, reconfiguring that area down there outside the elevator to, again, somewhat secure it. I think the general intent that if somebody is coming into the building interested in creating problems, we're at least going to put some barriers. They're going to have to either knock something down or get through a door. From a public service standpoint, wish we didn't have to do that. But so we're going to reconfigure those counter spaces down there, still accommodate having the ability to sit down, especially from the tax standpoint. I think we'll completely redo that so that there's little work areas where someone could sit down and we could help them prepare their tax returns, not just up at a counter open to everybody. Those are those type of improvements. I know up here on the second floor with planning moving out, there's some moving around of office space that might entail some moving of some walls, interior walls, nothing structural to any great extent. So those are primarily what we've kind of kicked around. As Tom and I were talking a while back, you know, with where we're at, and I think I'd mentioned on a couple occasions, we did have a pretty decent budget year in 2018. Typically when we do these things, when it's City Hall, if it's some other building, whatever it cost, you know, maybe we look at it and say, let's not look at this as some sort of a phase thing. Let's take a look at the building. Let's at least find out what it might cost, make the internal improvements. We're not talking anything earth-shattering, but also perhaps look at the building from the exterior. You know, the Cohatch building and the annex building, whatever you want to call it, does have a certain look to it, which is nice. Depending on what happens to that old engineering building, that could be a focal point too. welcoming site. Maybe we take a look at this site and say, let's kind of wrap things together. I don't know anything in particular, but maybe there's some external type of things where we can kind of fix that up and look at it and say, let's make some improvements. We're going to create dust. We're going to create, shutting some things down. But when we're done, there's really no reason to look at doing anything to any great extent to the building for the next, who knows how long, 10, 15 years.
It's been 25 years really since we've done anything here.
And sometimes it's a matter of looking a little bit more broadly. When we redid the building, we have no generator in the building because, again, cutting things down to the bones. Even some of those sort of things, making the building function a little bit more from that standpoint. Some of it may just be from a technology standpoint and making stuff a little more easier to use. One of the advantages we'll have is a little bit more space so we can have more conference rooms, but making those things functional. We had our ERP demos over the last 2-3 weeks and spent a lot of time in that conference room where council goes for executive sessions. And yeah, we kind of put a TV screen on the one wall, but some of these things, they just, and even some of the equipment that we use to have conference calls, it's like marginally reliable. Again, if we take a look at it and say, let's get the building up to a pretty functional, from a pretty functional standpoint. Again, we're not talking millions of dollars, but it might cost $500,000, $600,000, $700,000 in total. And so I'll stop talking. I don't know if you had any thoughts about that.
Tom, have we given any consideration to maybe bringing a consultant in to work with us on that whole project, security and all those kind of things?
So far, I mean, we used some third parties to assess the security issues through Chief Pichanowski and some of the resources he had. So we have the evaluations.
Okay.
We have Triad Architects. Triad Architects right now, we're working with them on evaluating some concept plans. I
Okay.
think, to kind of piggyback quickly on what Dean was saying, we're not ready yet to just give you, well, here's what our recommendation would be. We're getting closer. What I'd like to be able to do with the opening of the new space next door, literally this will be the last space within the whole city enterprise that hasn't really been touched in 25 years. And could it go another 25 years conceivably, but security-wise, probably not. We should do
Right.
something there.
Right.
And we've got issues with, dated carpet. It's just kind of dated.
Right.
And it's the civic building. It's the city's primary civic building, and I think should be a nice looking and functioning building, and nothing extravagant, obviously. So, but yeah, we have the consultant's recommendations regarding some of the security upgrades we should be making. What we're trying to do is marry that up now with some of these space changes. We've met with the various departments about space needs, down where Dean is, including up in this area. We're just trying to figure out what that order of magnitude is going to be. But if ideally we could couple it with this financing, we just have to kind of accelerate the timetable here and get something back to you guys and get your thoughts about it. But
Let's get some rough estimates.
Yeah, I think-
some idea what kind of figure like Dean said, maybe a ceiling or whatever.
yeah, and I think what we're trying to work on is if we take a look at what we previously had appropriated, what the current appropriations are, and take a look at if that's a $500,000, but it's going to take another $150,000, but this is what it's going to get you, or whatever the amount is. We want to bring that back to you and make sure it makes sense. But
I can come back as part of that first reading on the bond legislation, and I don't know that we'll have concrete numbers on what it'll cost, but I can kind of show you what was included with the money we're borrowing. What I can tell you, I mean, the rough estimate and what we have appropriated is $218,000, and I'm like, I don't know. Well, I didn't really come up with that number, but gee, doesn't seem like you can even hire somebody to paint the building for $218,000. And then we also had with the improvements to what was going to be the parking lot, which was a lot more demo work and everything, $328,000. So we've got about $550,000 appropriated. Would it be above that? As Tom said, I don't know, maybe a couple $100,000. But I can show you what that may be with this borrowing. I may add a little bit more, not the full amount. If let's say it did cost us $900,000, Obviously, we'll pay cash for a portion of that and do it that way, but including it in with that borrowing makes it such enough to come back at some point down the road when we have better numbers and then, you know, do it at that point.
So,
Yeah.
but, I mean, it's really, we're at a point now where that's almost completed, and it's 25 years or so since this has been done, and if we wanna make that second floor function better and make these security upgrades, it's gonna cost us some money, so.
Sure.
We'll keep you posted on that.
If you recall, we had previous discussion at finance committee meetings about how this all would potentially work. We should be soon starting getting the rent from Cohatch, which is $78,000 a year. So this money we're borrowing in total, plus our current capital plan, we were on the tail end of paying off the debt issued for the streetscape project, I think by 2022. And we're currently paying about $278,000 a year. So the combination of that and some impact fee monies that we're able to utilize, we'll be able to spread that out in our capital plan and not have to come back and alter, you know, existing projects that are included in the plan, and that would still be the case. One of the things related to potential bond issue included in our capital plan and included in this year's budget was acquiring software, ERP software, primarily financials, but it impacts all the departments. It goes beyond that. As I mentioned a little bit ago, we've gone through a selection process, had RFP, we've done the demos, took forever, but we're at the point we're probably gonna move forward through that selection process. Probably the top candidate, their bid's $756,000 for their software. Close to what we had included in our capital plan. Plus we had another $250 in there. We were wanting to look at our document management systems. Just a real quick synopsis, the top vendor is a national firm. It's gonna elevate our ability to communicate internally, which is can be a little bit challenging at a department level to access information, and also externally, citizen access. It's a big part of what the capabilities we're gonna be able to deliver, them being able to get online, doing things electronically, and all that sort of stuff. So it does take us to a whole nother level. But all in all, it'll probably, by the end of the day, be close to $1 million in software application. I had intended to roll that in also with the funds that we were going to borrow. So that might be in the legislation also when it gets in front of you. And then the rec levy refunding issue, we kicked around. One of the things, we can't do an advance funding, refunding, but we can pre-sell the issue. In essence, it's negotiating with an investment banking firm, and we price it now, and then we wait until the earliest date that we can close, which would probably be the first of the year. In doing that, we can lock in the rates, but it's kind of like if you go out and you're building a house and you lock your mortgage in, 3, 4, 5, 6 months before all said and done. They're gonna want a little bit of a spread to cover interest rate fluctuations. I don't want to have to do that because I think we'll be in pretty good shape that the interest rate climate that's out there now for municipal bonds will probably hold through the remainder of the year. But it may be, for whatever reason, geopolitical, who knows what happens in this world nowadays, they start trekking up. I may come back and put some legislation in front of you and try to move quickly to capture the savings that we otherwise would obtain by doing a refinancing. Even if we did an advanced sale type of refunding now, and those rec levies, we would save money, a fairly substantial amount. It's kind of like a little bit of a roll of the dice. I don't know what the numbers would be, but if it's $1.2 million, if we were to do it soon, without their premium, it might be 1.76 million. So you roll the dice and hope that rates stay where they're at and don't go up. But we've kicked around the possibility of trying to push through as quick as we can, going back out and doing that. So I'll let you know. But right now, I think we're going to kind of hold with waiting till the end of the year and then doing another issue.
Okay. So moving on, then we have the update on the Southern New Community Authority financials?
I'm not gonna hand out a lot of stuff here today, but this is more of a policy issue discussion, so it's just that the numbers will maybe help make the dialogue go a little easier. We've touched on this a little bit in the past. Our community authority, the Southern Community Authority, obviously was put in place years ago, 7.5 mil charge on the people that live in the district. The intent was the community authority was gonna fund Glen Road. We pretty much identified all the costs associated with that, and we've kind of got that locked in. And the discussion is we're gonna have we usually meet once a year. The community authority is probably gonna meet in August of this year. Up until this point in time, I've always told them annually that really the only revenue source that is attributable to this is the community authority charges. When we started doing that development years ago, we also put a transportation fee in place of $1,000 a lot, not necessarily intended to pay for Glen Road cost, because that's what the community authority was going to do. This was going to be there and be available for other ancillary road improvement cost. Because shortly after we did this years ago, the housing bubble kind of burst a bit, and all the developers' projections of all the houses they were going to build dramatically went down. We kind of went into a conservative mode and looked at it and said, I'm not so sure this pencils out as far as cash flow with those community authority charges. So we took that $1,000 a lot fee that we've been collecting since 2005, and on the spreadsheet I handed out, it's the second column. It's totaled through the end of 2008, $1.1 million that we've collected. We haven't done anything with it. It was there potentially if we came up short and we were in a situation where all the costs we incurred to build the road and paying back that debt, if the cash flow from the community authorities wasn't sufficient, we'd use this. And if that wasn't sufficient, then we'd have to hit our general fund or whatever else. Much better position today. That's more than likely not going to occur. It's more a function of trying to predict how much longer this community authority charge needs to be in place. And I've run some projections. A lot of it depends on how many additional houses they may build. But I think we're talking something out maybe 2028. So 6, 7, 8 years or so. But I can project based on just a number. Let's say that we were to build 25 or 50 new houses out there. Whatever that year is, if we did not use any of these transportation impact fees, probably would add a year to the time that the assessment would be in place. So if you're a property owner, the year isn't so important, but it's generally pretty close to saying that perhaps by 2027, that would be the last year you would pay this additional $800 property tax amount, which is the 7.5 mils. If we elected to use those funds for other purpose, again, originally they were never intended to go to offset the cost or to reduce the time frame that this community authority charge would be in place, perhaps there's an additional year is what it would probably amount to, because that's roughly what's collected in the new community authority charges on an annual amount. So from a policy standpoint, if we do use not just the funds that have collected, but future funds, it reduces the time that community charge is going to be in place. So the question becomes, do we, a couple of ways of looking at it, we could go back and recapture all that $1.1 million and say it's still in that fund balance, because I've got about a $3 million fund balance sitting there, and including all future $1,000 transportation fees. Or we could look at it and say what already has been reflected in this information that's been shared with the community authority, but moving forward, since we no longer need to, any future transportation fees would not go towards paying off the outstanding debt.
Dean and I talked about this, and I know that there was a point when, I don't know if all of you were on council, when we set up that Economic Development Reserve Fund, one of the one of the rationales for setting it up at the time, as Dean indicated, back when we did it, was we were concerned at some point that we might not have sufficient revenue from those.
Community
from that
charges.
$7.5 million charge.
Sure.
So at that point, back in 2008, 2009, 2010, we were looking at every available revenue that we could use, and hence we started accounting for that transportation impact fee of $1,000 per lot. If you go back and look at when council set that up, while it could be used for Glen Parkway, there were other road improvements that were contemplated down there.
In that
for-
area.
In that area.
Yeah.
Cheshire Crossing, Extension, and some of these others.
Yeah.
So we're at a point, I mean, the good news is, we've reached a point financially with those
Right.
authority charges that it's covering now debt service.
Right.
And so, my recommendation, and we were gonna talk to we wanna chat with you guys about it first, but to the Community Authority Board, is that we don't need to reflect that now, necessarily. And that's been used, that can be used for other purposes. It's gotta be used for road improvements down in that area, and there is some background information I can provide to you when we set that up, what we're gonna use it for and whatnot. So, but as I say, the good news is we've gotten over that critical hurdle that we were at a few years ago. So,
My initial thought is that we talk all the time about the need to fund transportation improvements. It seems to me that an impact fee is better off set aside for transportation improvements as opposed to applying it to if we didn't promise that money to be applied up front, if it was it's here, we might have to use it, but it's a typical transportation impact fee, then to me.
it wasn't set up in the traditional sense of an impact fee. It's kind of been a voluntary, agreed upon by the developer and the city.
Okay.
But as Dean indicated, we were at a point financially with this debt service that we really needed to account,
Right.
any revenue that we could
Sure.
allocate to,
Well,
we were. So we haven't spent it. but-
We set that aside, but on top of that, as Tom said, we created this fund, and we called it economic development, but behind the scenes, I knew we need to start putting some money aside so that if and when it does not cash flow, instead of us saying, oh, gee, we gotta reduce our budgets, operating budgets by $300,000, I had a cushion there built up that we could cover multiple years until things hopefully picked up. But again, as Tom said, that's not the case anymore. Even if there's no more houses built, the community authority charges will be sufficient to pay back the debt, even if we didn't allocate any of these funds to it. So it's really more of a policy issue. I have shared this information, but each year when I gave that to the community authority board members, none of which live there, although now we have some board members that do actually live down there, I caveated to say I'm reflecting this in this calculation which shows what they owe the city, but that's not a given. At some point, when we get to that point where we decide whether we need to or not, it was not necessarily intended to offset this cost. Like Tom said, it could be because the language that we put in place was broad enough. But we're gonna have another meeting in August, and this will be the first meeting where I finalized any of the debt issuance. Everything's pretty much complete. Up until this point, there was always some unknown. But now I'd like to finalize it with them and tell them, here's the projection, here's, if there's 25 houses a year built out there, the charge will go off in 2028. If there's 50 houses a year built out there, it'll go off in 2027. Give them some, because they keep asking, and I can't predict the future. I could also give them a scenario if nothing else gets built, it might be 2029. But this revenue, these funds impact that by as much of a year, one way or the other.
So anyway, we want to just make you aware of it. I don't know if it really requires, what are your thoughts? Do you think with the amount of transportation improvements that we identified when we set this up, there's clearly other needs.
Makes sense to me.
But I think before we finalize it, what I would do is I would get with Bill, and I would say, this is where we think those dollars should be allocated, whether it's the extension of, remember we looked at Cheshire Road abandoning the old Cheshire Road
Oh,
and putting in
right.
that
Yeah.
connector through
Yeah,
there.
Walmart connector.
Yes. Doing some of those things, it can't really be used for maintenance, it's gotta be used for.
New construction.
Yeah, new construction.
Or
But there was-
additional capacity.
Yeah, there were some other projects, but if you're generally thinking this might make sense, what I can at least do is provide you kind of a review of what council was thinking about when we set this up, because I'm going back, we put this in place back in 2005, this additional $1,000, and we've been collecting it just down in that southeast area, because we knew that we had a lot of needs down there.
Right.
But we also set up the 7.5 mils was really principally for Glen Parkway. But as, you know, when we were financially kind of unbalanced there, that's when we started accounting for this other revenue source. So,
The timing is such, our capital plan is due to go to council by August 15th. This NCA meeting typically is first or second week in August. And hopefully before then, Tom's had an opportunity, we not just say that we're not going to use it for this, here's what we might be looking and include that in our capital plan that gets submitted. And so then there's a little bit more something behind it, because quite frankly, if you were a resident out there, if I lived out there and I was paying that 7.5 mil charge, I'd say sooner than later.
Right.
Why use it for other improvements, reduce my tax bill? And that's the public policy side of it. You know, obviously there's a counter to that, so.
When are you gonna be speaking to Bill, you think? When do you guys?
I'll get with him, I've got a meeting with him tomorrow,
Okay.
Chris, so I'll just ask him to provide me with, it's just kind of an update
Mhm.
of some of the other needs down there, and
Right.
not that this 1.1 will pay for all, but at least it's revenue. We
Mhm.
talk about transportation needs and things like that, so, but I can then follow up with city council or find.
Is there a certain geographical limit that has to be?
We've generally said southeast, so it's
Mhm.
probably south to Peach Blow Road, east to the railroad tracks, probably north up to probably Berlin Station Road.
Okay.
Okay.
And I've gotta get back with Dave as well, because he's the one who works with the developers when we're actually requiring that payment. But if you take a look at any of those plat improvements or subdivision improvements that we do down there, generally there is in those list of conditions that they pay that $1,000 transportation fee. We're not calling it an impact fee, we're just calling it a transportation fee. So.
Including the Gurdon annexation, I believe.
Yeah, the Gurdon would include that, so,
Mhm.
so that's another, I don't know how many homes they were thinking about down there, was it 4?
Thought it was 263.
Is it
I thought
So I
it was-
thought too, like 265 or something like that.
Okay, so, that's just an update, really, just because we know that this we've got this meeting with the finance, with the new community authorities.
At some point, maybe in a broader stance, because, you know, it's been a long time since things are happening out there and the world around us has changed, but as you recall, we also have a residential TIF in place that's going to make that connection from where it stubs over north of, Berlin Station. And those things are moving forward. I think we just acquired the land from the large property owner. That'll be a pretty expensive improvement, but those TIF revenues will cover that. But going further north, this is more of a bigger picture. We need to plan what we think we need to do. You know, is a community authority charge the way we did it still viable? The problem is it's gonna require probably the city, if we take that on, us to front end it all again. And we may be back in the same boat where we make $15 million of road improvements, hoping that development occurs. But I think we ought to game plan a little bit more how that road, what are the possibilities to take that road from where it stubs up to Glen Road from the north, where the other community authority, the road stops up there. Is it feasible? Is there a different, you know, are these things, we're probably not gonna be able to do a residential TIF again. I think those are kind of out. But is this community authority, when we originally laid it out years ago, there were 3 different tiers to this, and it was all gonna happen, but things have changed, and I think that's something from a big picture standpoint we ought to consider.
Yeah, I think just from a policy standpoint, to your point, that, you know, we can't encumber so much within just a given segment of our community to provide a lot of this funding. So, you know, we need to figure out how to spread that wealth around on a more equitable basis. Because obviously, Glen Road will be, if and when that ever does get all the way back, all the way up there to 36, 37, yeah, that's a community-wide, regional actually benefit. So they're, you know, just to have all those people in the southeast paying significant monies for that, yeah, I kind of have some issues there.
Yeah.
But I don't know what that looks like from a standpoint of how do we get a more level funding
Well, that's
across our
item,
community. Yeah.
6.
Yes, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
That would start with probably a more, kind of where we were in 2016.
Exactly. Exactly. I think there's some of that makes sense, you know, when you're talking smaller things like roundabouts or specialized intersection improvements or different things like that maybe are more micro-geographic driven and beneficial. Yeah, I think maybe those new community authority monies and or set aside impact fee monies are beneficial there. But I just hate to encumber those people down there with more and more while, you know, supposedly, you know, some other people are reaping those benefits without actually incurring those additional costs, so.
Well, if nothing else, if we're still going to take somewhat of that approach, I'd argue, make it a part of when they build the house as an incremental cost.
Mhm.
Because, you know, whether they sell that house for $350,000 or $356,000 isn't gonna make a hill of beans really in the market, but that
Yep.
$6,000 paid up front as opposed to $700 a year with their property tax, that just creates a lot more complainers.
Yes.
And, so somehow we need to find a way, if at all, if we're going to use that as a primary funding source, to shift that, I think, to you know, plus it reduces our risk of, you know, being exposed, and now there's no development, but.
Mhm.
So that's just an update on that.
Okay. So then, number 5.
Just, we're moving along in this
Yep.
process. We've met with most of our operating departments regarding their requests. Probably not a lot of changes to format and presentation this year. We're gonna be putting that on Alicia's shoulders for the 2000, for the next iteration of the capital plan. But I intend to get Kyle involved in the CIP process as well. It just adds a little more staff capacity
Right.
to putting this together. But so that's, I don't know, Dean, did you have anything on that?
No, I think originally this was from a previous finance committee meeting we were gonna have a while back, and we already had some discussion about carryover from 2018 and how we might allocate some additional funding towards our capital plan and how we might utilize that. If you recall, we did step up the amount of road maintenance resurfacing we're doing in our residential. Plus we had kicked around this notion of the gas tax change and how that impacted our capital plan. Kind of talked about it for 2019. When we review the 2020 to 2024, we'll talk more specific how that, you know, plays out in the long-term planning. But there really haven't been a lot of, we're almost halfway through the year, not a whole lot of surprises that have come up, so I think we're in pretty good shape.
Good.
I think the biggest, you know, one of the things we continue to wrestle with here internally from a utility expansion standpoint is the whole southwest area, and taking a look at the Sawmill Corridor and trying to figure out, well, strategically, what are the right investments we should be making as a community with respect to that 2,000-acre area. You know, obviously, we don't have a blank check to do everything we want to do, so we've got a meeting tomorrow with some folks who are working with the Wilgus, with that Wilgus property, in terms of taking a look at that. So hopefully, if we can nail some of this down, we might have a recommendation that would be part of the CIP that would talk about where some of those strategic investments should be made.
Have you been able to make any more inroads with the Crown Group?
No, we haven't, unfortunately, George. It's just, it's been really disappointing.
It's too bad.
Unfortunately, that's a prime piece of property that, you know, that 42, and, so,
Okay. All right, so moving right along. Number 6, our transportation funding update.
yeah, so you'll recall at the retreat, when this was discussed, with council, there was the, discussion about, well, let's have the finance committee talk about this. You know, instead of prolonging the retreat another few hours, it was, well, let's have the finance committee take a look at it. And so, I provided you some, information about what the gas tax, the additional gas tax would generate, for the city, and obviously that kicks in on July 1st. And that, we're roughly thinking $650,000 approximately, based upon what was finally agreed upon by the House and the Senate. So you've got, and that's really gonna help us with jump-starting some of our local street resurfacing stuff in 2019. But that combined with, if council's inclined to move on the permissive fee, which is that additional $5, similar to what the county did, you know, gets us up to, you know, close to $800,000, which is a
Yeah.
substantial increase.
On top of what? The original?
So the gas tax amount, Chris, was around 650,000, so we're thinking about 160 to 200,000 would be the permissive fees. So those two.
But that's on top of what?
Really on top of the
What we
150,000.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I'm
We had
asking.
Yeah,
like-
so 150,000 is what we were previously thinking we could allocate
Okay,
for,
for-
because recall, we diverted some of our available discretionary transportation dollars to the point.
So basically going
Yeah.
from 150 to almost $1 million then.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you wanna add the,
Mhm.
yes,
Right.
yeah, and it's a big jump.
Yeah,
Now,
yeah.
is it adequate, to do everything we wanna do? No, but it is a substantial help.
Right.
So we need to decide at some point, what's the game plan? What should the game plan be with respect to what what some of the surveys have told us, which is if you are gonna consider a levy at some point in the future, do it short and do it, you know, targeted.
I think we talked at the retreat about seeing what this $1 million got us before we talked
Right.
any further about a levy, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's really,
But I think it's important that we present this publicly, that it is a significant improvement. You know, we've got a list that Bill has created of
Yeah.
everything we'd ever like to do, and of course, that would take millions and millions of dollars a year, but rather than say, well, yeah, it's nice to have 800,000, but it really isn't gonna do, I think we should say, no, this is a significant improvement in our ability to do maintenance. I mean, how we present that message is important.
yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you definitely want to show the positives of it, but at the same point in time, you don't want unbridled enthusiasm from the standpoint of, well, now you don't need anything.
No, that's not what I'm saying, I just,
Yeah.
when this gets talked about, though,
Yes.
it gets talked about as, you know,
Yeah.
we got this much to do.
No, I know.
Right.
And I
No,
think
yeah.
it
Goes along.
significantly
Yeah.
reduces that gap that
Yeah.
we had, that
Mm-hmm.
when we rolled out the transportation levy talking points in 2016, we had this huge gap, and 2 million is gonna be able to help us with that. Well, close to $1 million now
Yeah,
is helping them.
right. Yep. Very much so.
So then that brings up the question, if we are gonna talk about a levy, are we talking about a levy just for improvements, or are we talking about a levy just for infrastructure? Are we gonna talk about, like George mentioned, a particular project that we wanna do? Which seems to me more solvable than anything else, probably.
Yeah.
Well, the thing is, one thing you can ask yourself is, if you think, and maybe back to Chris's point, let's see what this additional revenue does with our local roads program. If we basically address a good piece of that, it's not the perfect world, but we rarely meet the perfect
Right,
world.
right.
If it's
Yeah.
addressed a significant piece of that, so then you're taking a look at, some of these capacity improvements, some of these other projects that we had talked about. And if we ever want a chance of doing those, that's where maybe you might want to have a little bit of revenue. But that's just something that
So if we continue to put the million, or the hundred and some thousand, whatever it is, in the budget each year that we put in this year for resurfacing, we should be able to count on this gas tax revenue and permissive fee revenue going forward, right? So we should be able to count on roughly $1 million a year.
Yeah, I think we'd wanna just, we'll have a pretty good idea
Right.
after July 1
Yeah.
what those numbers look
Yeah.
like. And then council will need to take, if you wanna go ahead with the $5, the soonest that would kick in would be 21 for the registration year 21. So that would, those two things combined.
Right.
Plus the 150 that we had been previously allocating was getting you to that number, that $1 million number.
I know we're spending some money with the county on Section Line Road. That, we didn't divert the 150 to that, did we? What are we spending?
No, I
on
can't,
this?
we did Dean, do you recall how we handled that? That was a supplemental, was the Section Line Road participation, I don't know.
What's the question related to?
Well, it was whether we took the 150,
Right, where'd that money come from and how much was it for the County Line Road project? We didn't take the 150 that we set aside for resurfacing.
I thought we did.
We pretty much did. It's like 108 of the 150, so if you go back to last year when we adopted our plan, we didn't have a whole lot going towards local resurfacing in our subdivisions, and that was a big debate because Section Line Road really isn't that, but, you know, the county was doing it and whatever, so, that came out of the, what otherwise was designated as the local road resurfacing allotment. But subsequent to that, we bumped up the amount just because we had some flexibility from 2018 carryover funds. And we also indicated that even though the gas tax isn't gonna start coming in till July 1st, we can roughly guess, I think we had a number, 200 or whatever it was. We're gonna also add that to our local road resurfacing efforts for 2019. I don't know if that's bid's gone out, Tom, do you know, or?
yeah, it's out now, so it's
Yeah.
come back. But what's the general thinking in terms of whether we need additional, I think there's no doubt that if you wanna do additional projects, whether it's East Central, whether it's, name the project, West Central, these other projects, you're gonna need additional revenue sources, but I know that.
Well, I still think part of that, what Bill's said all along, and of course, you can take an engineer's word for it, the perfect, if he had unlimited money, sure, he would spend a couple $1 million a year. But I think what's really important and what will really frame what we need to do with transportation dollars and also how we need to present it to the public if and when we go back to try and get some more is understanding, and I know Bill has this information, how the deterioration of roads increases at an increasing rate over time. Once you get to that C grade, then it, to get to D and F, it goes real quick versus from A to C takes maybe, 10 years. D to F only takes like 4 or 5 years. And getting an understanding of where we are with our road inventory to know where that is. Because even though we now have, let's say, $1 million to do, and knowing that we don't necessarily need $2 million a year, but we need something else, and understand how that funding gap is going to grow over time, I guess, is kind of get that, right now, we can do real good and we're maybe only down a couple $100,000 a year, but now as more and more roads become like slack road, now, that dollar per lane mile really ratchets up. I think that's important to get a good understanding of those projections, to know truly what our requirements are from a funding standpoint 3 years, 5 years, 7 years down the road.
When you say to get a clear understanding, to have that, are you talking from a council perspective at some point in the near future to look at what if so, what type of revenue source might be pursued? Or are you talking from the community standpoint, understanding that, there's future costs here that are, you pay me now, pay me later type of things that are just getting to be, more and more?
Yes and yes, but initially, I think really it needs to be from a council standpoint, an understanding of, how that gap widens over time, if it does widen over time. Based on what Bill's told us in the past, we perceive that is going to grow over years, just not because you're underfunding by a couple $100,000 a year, but because now that $50,000 improvement, is now costing you $125,000. So, getting an understanding of that so that we can gain a consensus on council as to what our viable options are, and then to go out there and get that information out to the public from a standpoint that, how to make that understandable to the public.
One of the things, and we talked a lot about this after that retreat, because we've had those of sorts before, and I think there's a general understanding of the challenge, and there's anybody's opinion about how best to communicate it or not, or if we need a levy, and to what type and when, but one of the things I think would be helpful to start working on now, because I think the gas tax and, kind of, if anything, we're gonna probably have to wait a while, a year or two, just to see what that means. Can't imagine us putting a levy out there and it having any chance of passing when people are now just starting to pay higher gas taxes. But trying to put together a timeline, instead of just looking at it today or the next council retreat, if we looked at it over a 2, 3, 4 year period, and we focused our time not specifically on what or how or when, but let's start creating a game plan to say in whatever, March of 2020, we're going to have information like this made as part of a discussion at a council level. We've looked down the road a little bit longer and said, if there were to be some sort of a voter-approved initiative, more than likely it might be out here in year, 2022, and start putting together a little bit of a game plan to at least stay on task. And who knows, maybe at some point there's 4 or 5 different points along that time frame, and one of those midway through maybe it's just not as urgent today, and we're going to hold on this for a period of time. But otherwise it becomes the same old, we got to get back together, and then we're going to have elections at different times and different council people. If we can look at it maybe from the standpoint of saying, here's what, and at least try to build a timeline over a 3, 4, 5 year period, and put some initiatives of sorts, whether it be staff or meeting with council, and maybe even reaching out to the public a little bit, and put them in a window maybe of a 4 to 5 month period where we need to get this scheduled. We know what the next task is. Otherwise it becomes, I know from a staff, not to speak for Bill, it's all that information, like you said, he's had it, he's presented it, it's, how many times can you turn it around? And it's really trying to see if there's a way to come to some consensus, and part of that, may mean we've got to involve other people outside city staff and city council, but.
Yeah.
And at least something is a takeaway from the retreat, other than just, it's still looming out there, we still haven't cracked that nut, so to speak.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
So what do you think the direction back to us should be on this question?
Restate the question again.
Well, what generally, how do you develop this game plan if you're gonna have one,
I think we, kind of
Customer needs.
falls down to Bill. I mean, like I said, we have to see what's, that $1 million is gonna do.
okay.
And, I mean, I guess he does have a prioritized list at this
Yeah,
time.
right,
Right,
yeah.
so,
Yeah, I think he's gone over some of this with
Yeah.
Public Works, so.
Yeah, I think that's the first step, is to assume that we have $1 million a year.
Right.
What are we gonna get for that? What's the 5-year projection of how much we're gonna get
Right.
done with that $1 million? Once we have that, we can start talking about what other maintenance things we may or may not wanna fund, and what other infrastructure improvements we may or may not want.
now I'm having a hard time pulling that document up. Is he listed as, like, F up through A, or is it, I mean?
No,
I
well.
think maybe go back to George, is he able to like look at that list and?
So he did-
Can he do B, C, you know,
He
L and
sent this
K?
out, which everybody has.
Right,
This
right.
is
Yeah.
just all the streets.
Right.
And then he updated kind of what are we looking, if we look at over the next 5 years, what's our backlog in terms of our local roads, what's our backlog in terms of our collector roads, he's got that as well, so. The information's there, I think, it's just trying to be more responsive to what you think you
Yeah.
need in order to.
I just know, even with $1 million, what I hate to see is, you know, now there's a bigger chunk of money is, you know, to put it all towards, you know, the collector roads right out of the gate, and then we're still, got all these residential problems.
Right,
Which is what we get 90% of the
Our.
calls about.
You know, our direction, my direction to Bill and the council's action, and what the budget will reflect, it does reflect, is this additional dollars, is local streets. It's the gap that we had, when we had to reduce back the amount that we had for our local streets.
Yeah.
But if you look at, Bill's local street resurfacing backlog is 21 miles of streets at $8.6 million. Now that would, today, if you had $8.6 million, in theory, you bring that all back up.
Right.
That's not gonna,
Yeah.
that can't happen like that. But clearly, if you're only spending $150,000 to $200,000 a year, you're going up to 800 to $1 million. That's a
Right,
pretty big
yeah.
jump. But it's a pretty big backlog as well, so.
As your point, it's $8 million now, but over the course of the next 7 years.
Years,
it's
yeah.
a lot more than $1 million.
Yeah, because that C road becomes a D or an F road. Yeah.
Then we have those network improvements we talked about at one point, we have those capacity improvements.
Yeah, and I think all the major improvements, all your big capacity improvements are really going to have their own separate funding mechanism, whatever that is, whether it's a levy, whether it's some type of impact fees, whatever it is, but it needs to be a community-wide type thing versus just this little group is paying this to get those things done. Because, I mean, we're just seeing, I mean, when we look at the numbers on the point project cost, just every time I look at that number, it's ratcheted up. What are we up to now? It's up 26 million now for the point. A couple years ago it was 21, now it's 26, and it's just going through the roof, and we need to figure out how that is. I mean, obviously, we still think we can cover that gap somehow, but we're also still looking for money, right?
Yes, we
So-
are, and we still haven't ruled out, obviously, the county, we still haven't, obviously, the JED's helping us, but.
Yeah.
We haven't looked up the county.
Yeah,
So-
that was the
I'm not sure
operative.
Well, I'll follow up with Bill, and,
Okay.
try to come back with some, just kind of a general outline of how we might want to approach this.
Yeah.
Yeah, that piece from Bill would be helpful, like you were going to do with $1 million.
And I think he may have gone over that, Chris, I just can't remember if that,
Yeah.
goes over a lot of information at
Yeah.
those public works meetings, but I don't know if that was part of it, so.
Okay. All right, so now on to the cemetery master
The more enlightening part of the discussion on the agenda. I included in your packet, and we've had some previous discussions at the Finance Committee meeting about our cemetery and a master plan process that we went through. They have finalized that master plan, and if you recall, part of the purpose of that, we needed to expand capacity out there. We had no new burial spaces. We had empty space. We had farm fields, but we needed to look at how we were going to expand. City hasn't done much with opening up new sections since we took it over from Oak Grove Association, but even Oak Grove, all they were doing was adding a new section for traditional burials. That really was their only product mix, and that's really all we have right now. And pay attention to what's happening in the whatever cemetery or burial business. Fewer and fewer people are opting for traditional burials. There's all kinds of alternatives beyond that. And so one element of the plan was to look at the the site out there, and what is a logical way, not just to expand and open up some space for traditional burials, but what about some of the other elements that might make it a little bit more viable. From a sheer economic standpoint, we subsidize that cemetery operation to maintain what's there. The revenues that we're currently generating are not covering the cost of mowing and taking care of the facility that's out there. And absent us doing something to generate more revenue, we're not going to ever get to that point. We're having diminishing sales of new sites or new spaces, primarily because what is left is the back 40 section of that, and it's just not the most attractive area. So that doesn't help sales from that standpoint. Another element of the master plan, we wanted them to look at the rules and regulations, what can you put on the site and all that sort of stuff. And then the third element was just looking at it more from that business perspective. And what's the business side of running a cost-effective, at least if you can, cemetery in today's environment. And so they did complete their work. We did one part of that was to have a little bit of a public meeting. And we had some people that were affiliated with the cemetery in the past, some residents have been in town for a while, and some others that came in. And the consultants presented their game plan. And there was a lot of positive discussion about, yes, it's about time, there's other options, columbariums and other things at that cemetery, and a lot of interest, a lot of support for the concepts that they came up with. I want to touch on a couple of them because they spill over into that business side of things and what might be a proposal I'd like to be able to make as part of our capital plan that gets submitted later in the year. I'm going to kind of jump through this. I'm not going to read any of this sort of stuff. It was all included in your packet. But in general, from a development standpoint, we were basically, and this is the whole cemetery area from South Sandusky over to Liberty. This is heavily wooded, going to be a little bit difficult. Plus there's a storm drainage swale in there. It's kind of hard to do a whole lot with, but we could utilize it. This is the empty field that exists out there along Liberty. This is the front entrance, and we've had some discussion about the existing house that's been, the abandoned house of sorts that's out there. And this is an area, part of the way back that we need to do some storm sewer work. The city has a storm sewer. It's a major part of our storm sewer collection system that drains a lot of this area to the west. It comes through in an open swale through the wooded area, and then it goes, unfortunately, under some grave sites and whatever else in a buried pipe. There's some issues with the capacity of it, and at some point we'll have to tackle those. I hope we don't have to come in and disinter bodies to open up and daylight a storm sewer through there. But there are some storm sewer implications, including in this general area, what we refer to as a creek walk. There's some erosion because it does open back up into an open drainage course as you get further to this side of the cemetery. And there's erosion issues and different things like that. When we were going through this process, the consultants, it's one of the things they picked up on right away. That area there would lend itself very well towards adding a product mix that could be very attractive in such a way that you could deal with your erosion issues and also create some burial options. But those are the three primary areas when we were looking at development. And they've talked about design features and concepts and what things could look like. And again, a big part of the business plan, we have to not just provide other options, but there needs to be a certain aesthetic look. People aren't going to want to go put their cremains in a columbarium concrete thing that just sits out in the middle of nowhere on a slab of concrete. A lot of it's the aesthetic side of things that help bring out and help you sell the spaces. And as I'll get into here, you'll see a little bit some of the cash flow issues. These are just pictures that they added. There's nothing specific there. This does look at I think that's the drainage area. You can see it's underground for a little bit of the way. This is the back area that's open to doing whatever. And these are the other two sites, so let's keep moving. One of the concepts that they came up with, and this is the front part of the cemetery. Here's Sandusky Street, here's the main entrance. It's really, as the consultants indicate in their narrative, it's just really not all that terribly inviting. The old house sits here. We have our maintenance facility up here, which isn't all that terribly attractive. This is kind of a sloping hill. There's a lot of space here. None of this obviously exists. And they really identified this as one of those prime areas where you could reuse land and really, really add a lot, not just the options that you could do at those areas, but just improving the entranceway for existing traditional burials and whatever else. So that's one of the recommended improvements they have. This is that creek area that I talked about that needs some storm sewer improvements. We've got a bridge here and there's a lot of erosion. So this is what they ended up with on that back area. It's kind of like how we're going to lay out the roads instead of just going in this grid pattern here. So this has all generally been laid out and I think been vetted by a number of different people, and that seems to work. We're obviously not going to put that all in at one point. It's going to, as we need the capacity, but most of this is traditional type of burials, in the ground, caskets type of thing. There are some areas here where there can be columbariums, where for people that are cremated, they can be put in there. Plus this lake, which is going to be dug to help with drainage and a couple other things, has all kind of possibilities to create attractive area that you can, as I'll show a little bit later, have some burial options included. So they also pulled together some cost to do all of it, and then they had some recommendations. And part of their recommendation was, phase one was that Oak Grove Memorial Garden, which is that back area, and then having cremation capabilities back there, and then the front gateway garden, such that this is basically what they would do with their initial recommendation. So in that back area, which is much broader, start here with the access point off of Liberty Road, try to improve that, and use this area primarily for traditional burials, and then this area here, which is, I don't know what the acreage, I can't read it here, but that would be this, what they call the cremation area. And again, to phase it, it may not all be built at one point in time, but to put some columbarium type of things and some landscape and maybe some pavers around here. The veterans section is right over here. Their concept calls for like a gazebo type of thing. And I know that would be huge out there, even for existing burials. There's really no place to go if there's any sort of rain, or to even have a small little ceremony of sorts. Again, all those things from a business standpoint that make it a little bit more attractive. And then their first phase is starting at the entrance point, cleaning up the asphalt that's everywhere, and start to build in more of the gardens area. I'm going to try to talk relatively fast. They put together some cost numbers, and I won't focus on them. I'm going to talk about them here. And then there were some other recommendations, and at some point, if you want to take a look at it again, it was in your packet about how to do marketing and how to do some business things. But I did want to touch a little bit on that notion of moving forward. What do we do from here? We do have some money appropriated this year out of the cemetery fund, and it's using existing perpetual funds that flowed over from the Oak Grove Association. Our next step, one way or another, is to actually do some final design so we can actually get out there and move some dirt. We really, really need to do that one way or another, even if it's really small scale and it's only traditional burial sites, because we do get people wanting to come in and buy a space, and there's just not any of them that are opened up other than some infill as we buy back some spaces. But what we'd like to be able to do is bring somebody in to start perhaps considering those first phased improvements, at least at a minimum. When we used the consultants' estimated numbers, it totaled $650,000. And that includes some of these columbarium things and a lot of the other things. What I want to do is talk a little bit about, with the Finance Committee, in a little bit of time we have before 5 o'clock, about this notion of maybe looking a little bit beyond that, and perhaps a number, not to float nice even one out there, but if it's $1 million, it's one of those things we could include, not with the current borrowing that we're doing, but the one that'll be done at the end of the year for the rec improvements. And I want to talk a little bit about how that might work, what happens to that $1 million. A lot of that cost would be in the aesthetic side of things, and that's important for the cemetery as a whole. It is somewhat of a park-like setting. It's the other thing that came out of our public meetings. A lot of people ride their bikes through there. They walk through there. It's as much of a park setting of sorts, although to some people it seems odd, as some of our other passive parks. And the more we can do to do that. It really, is in the same boat with some of our other park improvements. But I wanted to throw out a couple of numbers. We've been really checking around with other cemeteries, checking around with the people that might be selling us these columbariums and what else. The consultant had, their background and their information, but kind of discounted some of the numbers they were floating around. We reached out. Marion has a pretty nice, I don't know if you've been up to the Marion Cemetery. I believe theirs is still run by an association. It's not so much the city of Marion, it's an association. And they have a guy that's been doing it for a while. He's pretty shrewd about this stuff. And they do a really, really good job with what they do. I've got a couple pictures here, and these were pictures we got from up in Marion. And I just want to show you a little bit of some of the things that they have up there. Now, this one doesn't look as attractive because of the mud. They just poured that concrete. I'll show you some other pictures. But this is what is considered a columbarium. It's a 48-unit columbarium. So there's 24 niches on each space, and basically somebody's cremated, they'll go in there. And I think up in Marion they even do they have the equipment to do the lettering and all that sort of stuff. But to buy one of those granite or whatever nice stone material you wanted, for 48 units, it cost about $10,000 to buy that. Perhaps another $1,000, probably high, to pour some concrete to have it set out there. That gives you 48 niches. What Marion charges, and I think they're on the low end, is $2,000 for a single niche to be interred in there, plus some other costs if you have anything associated with actually putting it in there. So you do the math, 48 times 2,000 is 96,000. Our costs are about $11,000. So we got $85,000 cash flow with each one of these units we put out there. Now, again, you can't just plop that out in the middle of the field. Nobody's probably going to. It helps if there's some landscaping around it and it looks relatively nice, and that's where some of that incremental cost comes into play. I'm going to show you some other pictures from up in Marion. This is another area up there. Again, you can see the pavers. You can see kind of how it's landscaped. I'm going to go through these relatively quickly. It's just a different view, and I'll talk about these, what appear to be boulders. This is an option, a burial option. They call it a bench. To put one of these and place this out there, we've checked into the cost to buy that. Our cost will be about $1,000 to set that out there. On the low end, $4,400 is what you could charge. And those things that's what they want to do. They don't want to just have some headstone or whatever else. And they have a lot of them up at Marion. You can see them, they're all over the place. I'll talk about them now. These things that look like boulders, those are two-person with cremated remains. There's actually a price on it. Again, it's a little less than $1,000, and you really don't. You can put it in an area that you just do landscaping. You don't even need a lot of concrete or anything like that. But those things, again, $1,000, $3,000 at the bottom end is what they pay for. So that cash flow from that is really has a whole lot of potential. These are some of the bigger areas. They've had columbarium options out there for years, and they got big areas where they have all kinds of different options related to that. Let's see, this is another different type of thing, which is, and again, you can kind of see the what they've done up there around the area. It's just another picture. When we look at the layout and what the consultants had put in place, we've got plenty of space up there, even not in the new section where the field is, just in the existing cemetery where we can go in, we can tap, we got the trees, we've got the natural look. It's a matter of going in there and putting in, whether it be pavers, whether it be putting other things. Columbariums, those sort of things I've talked about, they're very popular. One of the other things that's out there that we don't have an option for is something called a scatter garden, and there's a couple small ones, some of the churches have them, where you really don't have any sort of a marker. I'm going to see real quick, and I know we've got a meeting at 5 o'clock.
Generally, the question would be, and I know there's a lot of information here, is there's an opportunity. We need to decide if we want to reinvest in really the only city municipal cemetery we have. Obviously, it was Oak Grove Association is now ours. If it does make, it can pencil out, what's the general thinking? Because we are starting to see that the changing preferences that people have in terms of how they're buried, and it's
Mhm.
changing. And you're now getting into these situations where people at the open house, we had a couple that live at Willowbrook, they want to be buried here, but however, they from the cemetery, they don't see that we have a columbarium option. Why don't you have a columbarium option? We've lived our lives here, we want to have a final resting place here, so, general thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, when we looked at these initial master plan a
Yeah.
year or so ago,
Yeah,
and that upfront where we have the erosion and doing the columbarium in the kind of against that, lack of a better word, cliff, I guess, kind of reset into that on the far side of the creek there. I mean, that, and then building that out and, getting rid of the old house and making that more of a meeting area up there. I mean, to me, that would be the starting point. That, and then, as we're getting monies into our tree fund from various developments, I think we should be planting the heck out of that back end while we have that plan in place to start to get something, because, nobody wants to be planted in a cornfield. And
so you'd be support this kind of because really,
Oh,
it's-
absolutely.
we're at kind of a fork in the road. If you will.
yeah, I mean, because if we don't do anything, it's just gonna continue to cost us money. And there's no benefit to be accrued. I mean,
And you're gonna have residents saying, we've got this
Yeah.
140 acres, what are you gonna do with that?
Yeah.
Chris, I know you've done some walking out and caching out there.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea.
From a dialogue standpoint, I want to finish up here. Again, we want to go to that next step and bring in the design people that we can actually start moving some dirt. So we're going to need, whether we do some of the work in-house or whether we have some small different elements to it, but bringing in the people and say, not just concept plans like this, we need specifics. We need something we can turn around and build and start on. And to do that and do it on a small scale and just open up some space. But if we look bigger picture, I honestly think, I know, Tom, we were talking about that today, even if we pushed it up to, let's just say $1 million, I think we could do a whole lot out there. I think the cash flow, now, can I sit here and predict that we're gonna have 100 people a year buy those niches? I can base it a little bit on the volume that Marion does, and they are very popular. And the flip side of it is we don't have a lot of costs. We don't have to dig a grave. We don't have to do a lot of those things with what we currently have. And we'll adjust our pricing. We still want people to be able to afford to do it, not just price everybody out. But I think the cash flow from that will not only cover our capital costs, but also help control that subsidy we have to maintain the rest of the facility. But to do that, we've got to front the money. And I just wanted to see if you had an appetite. If we did, there is a certain risk that we put these improvements and nobody wants to be buried out there. I don't, it's not a total loss because there will continue to be people that'll be buried out there. It's whether we can add to our product mix, so to speak, and even encourage more people. And I think the economics look pretty upbeat. When I look at the cash flow on some of these things, and we need that initial, because even to get it rolling, you got to look a little bit more broadly than just a little corner over here. Because if driving in there, it's not a place you really want to have your relatives come for a funeral. Not that it's that bad, it's okay, but I think if we really take that up a notch, but again, the notion would be we'd borrow that money, we'd do those improvements. I think we'd see those sales go back in to cover that debt service, and incrementally as we add and fill them up, we'd be adding more and go that route.
I got a question. On page 24 and 25, it lays out that roughly $600,000 worth of stuff you're talking about. But back up page 21, they've got 4 projects there that come in at over $3 million. So
Well, that's if you did everything they were recommending to completion.
Okay.
And what they're saying is nobody's gonna, it's like building you need another factory and instead you build 4 of them, hoping you'll get up to that capacity. We're not gonna sell that many of them, so it'll be an incremental. As your cash flow comes in from the first phase here, it might be 5-7 years out, but now you start expanding on the existing plan and adding the next level.
we're talking about doing these page 24 and 5, that $550,000.
Yeah, what they've identified is, again, it's about 650 for these first three elements. And again, just like this, out in that back area, it doesn't necessarily include this gazebo, but I think I'd like to have a little bit of latitude as we look at this to say, you know, if we do put this gazebo in here, I mean, that helps in a huge way, because the demands when there are funerals out there just aren't, I mean, maybe they put a tent up or something like that, but it just really adds a lot. So it may be a little bit above their estimates, but I think that payback on that will really occur. And then at some point, you go back and you put these columbariums. That's what these things are. They're more than 48, but as you sell them, as these sell out or start getting to that point, you put the next one. But you've already got it planned out. We may only pour, whether it's concrete or grit material, then 5, 6, 7, 8 years later, if it's moving pretty good, you finish the rest of it off. Like with that front area where that house is, you know, initially making these improvements improve the look coming into the facility as a whole. That is a benefit even to people that have a site out there, they just haven't, that exist. But to start this concept, one of the other ones that's a part of it, and I wish I had a little bit more time, I could show you some other pictures, is right off of South Sandusky, this area. This really doesn't cost a whole lot, it's mostly landscaping, but building into it this other option of kind of having not so much a monument, but you know, the only example I can give you is my grandson was stillborn a year ago, and my son and daughter-in-law are affiliated with Lakeside at Chautauqua, but Marblehead, and they built a really nice memory garden. I mean, it's nice. But to even go in there and have some cremated remains put into a site, it's all GPS, so nobody's going to commingle. And there's an unlimited amount of spaces you could do that. It's $2,000. Now, their cost was to put the fountain and the nice decorative bricks and all that sort of stuff to make it attractive. But if that pencils out over a 20-year time, that'll pay for itself 10 times over. And I'm not necessarily saying we need to initially get to that level, but I think getting the ball rolling. So real quick, because if we hire these design people, if you're thinking you're comfortable, if part of our capital plan will show that at that time, is to at least try to tackle those first phase recommendations and move forward in that regard. Okay.
We should move ahead.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and if we have the bond there that we can, you know, leverage that bond funding, that'd be
And
wonderful.
again, it's another one of those, how do you explain it to the public? This is revenue here, this is
Yeah.
it's not a question of put the money here or put it in roads, it's,
Right.
you know.
Right. Yeah, I
really
don't think we're
separate.
gonna have much problem with that.
Okay. That's all I had.
Okay, sweet. Anything else?
And we'll get another meeting going, but we'll
Yep.
have Elaine follow up, I know Kent, we've got a meeting.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So let's draw this one to a close. Do we have a motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn.
So moved.
We're at 6, right?
6 PM.
Take my bloody gauze.